be in an hour.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Zach Cooper. It's great to see you all here, and welcome to our audience online as well. We're really delighted to have two of our top national security experts in Washington here to talk about the transition from Bush to Obama, transitions of power in turbulent times. And I'm just delighted to have one boss and a friend, an old friend, who worked alongside me, really over me, at the White House, what seems like not so long ago, but increasingly is dating us a bit. So really wonderful to have you all here today. Let me introduce our guests first, and then we'll jump into questions and answers about halfway through the discussion. So first we have Stephen Hadley. He's a principal at Rice Hadley Gates and Manuel, LLC, an international strategic consulting firm. He served on a number of corporate and advisory boards and is executive vice board chair of the Atlantic Council, as well as the former board chair of the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he currently still sits on the board. Steve has served in a variety of positions in the U.S. government, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon and National Security Advisor from 2005 to 2009 under George W. Bush. Farah Pandith is Senior Fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and also an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert in the field of countering violent extremism. And Farah has a long history of public service with roles at the National Security Council, the State Department, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. While at the National Security Council, she served as the director for the Middle East Regional Initiatives from 2004 to 2007. And in the Obama administration, she also was appointed as the first ever special representative to Muslim communities. So I'm just delighted to have you both here. And what we're going to talk about today is this light book called Handoff, a mere 750 pages or so. When I think of a handoff, I usually think of a relay race. And if this is the baton that you're passing in the relay, we're probably going to drop it, which is, I guess, what the U.S. men's team usually does in relay races anyways. But we're really happy to get a chance to talk about this book, in which we all participated a bit. And so, Steve, I want to start with you and just ask you to give us a little bit of the background on why write this book, why write it now, and talk to us a little bit about the thinking behind Handoff.
So well, first, thanks. It's nice to be with you this morning. Thanks for doing this. Nice to be with you, Farah. The center of the book is some transition memos that were prepared by the Bush administration to give the Obama administration, to bring them up to speed on the issues of the day. There were 40 of them. There are 30 of them that have been declassified or in this book. Why the transition memos? George W. Bush, in the spring of 2008, turned to his chief of staff, Josh Bolten, and said, I don't know who's going to win this presidential contest in November 2008, but whoever does has got a real challenge. There's an ongoing war in Afghanistan, ongoing war in Iraq. There's the war on terror. That was before we knew we were going to be in the middle of the greatest financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression. And his view was the new team is going to have a lot on its plate that is going to hit it on the face on day one. And he was committed and told Josh Bolten that we want this transition to be the best transition in history. And once Barack Obama was the president-elect, they talked about this, and Obama had the same view. So you had this outgoing Republican president, incoming Democratic president, deciding they will work together and direct their staffs to work together to set a new standard for presidential transitions. And the transitions memos were part of this. They all had the same format. What did we find? What was our strategy? What did we accomplish? What remained to be done? And what was liable to hit the incoming administration in the face in its early months once it takes responsibility for all these issues? So we thought it was important to get that record out to the American people. A lot of people think all the Bush administration did was Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terror. And if you look at the table of contents of the book, you'll see we're dealing with 40 issues all the time, in real time, in parallel. And that's just the way it is if you're the United States of America, because we're so engaged in the world. We thought it would be useful, though, to have the people who wrote those memorandum or who worked on the issue to update them, to sort of describe what had happened under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, and then on the basis of that, look back and do two things. One, evaluate how the Bush administration did, what did we get right, what did we get wrong, and then, having seen 4 administrations over 20 years deal with the same set of issues, what are the lessons learned for future administrations? Because these issues are mostly still with us. They're in a little different form, but they're still with us, and they're liable to be with us for some time. So that's the book. For me, I thought it was important, one, to get the book out to show an element of what a good presidential transition would look like. I've been around a long time, and I was part of the transition from the Ford to Carter administrations. And I was asked to stay on for the first few months of the weeks of the Carter administration, which I did. Now, I'll tell you the situation I found. So when I left my office in the last day of the Gerald Ford administration, I had all my documents, and I was ready to go to manage the issues that were under my responsibility for the new team. When I came in the next day, the first day of the Carter administration, all the documents were gone. They were presidential records, so they went to the Ford library. There was no staff, because all the staff had been let go except for 3 or 4 of us. And so far as I know, there were no transition memos or anything else. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, comes in, first day in office. He has no documents to tell him where the issues stand, no staff to help him manage those issues, and no transition memos or anything else to get him up to speed. We've come a long way since then, and I think one of the things that the book does, and particularly one of the last sections by Martha Kumar, talking about the Bush to Obama transition, lets the American people know we've come a long way on presidential transitions. The other thing I thought it was useful, given that there is, I think, so much misunderstanding about Bush administration foreign policy, this seemed to be a good way to get a record out, and to get a record out not sort of looking back and saying how great we were, but giving people a chance to look at how we saw it at 2008 when we handed over the responsibilities in 2009 to the Obama administration. That's how we saw it then, and people can make their judgment about how we did given the subsequent events. So that's really the reason for it, and I hope it can provide a place where scholars and journalists and others just interested in foreign policy can go and learn about what was going on in those 8 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the great things about the book is that it actually has the transition memos themselves with only a handful of redactions, really, which is wonderful. And Farah, I want to ask you about one of the transition memos, which you drafted, which is on the war on terror and the war of ideas in particular. And just to delve down into this piece a little bit, how did you think about this then? How do you think about it now? What were some of your lessons looking back at this process about how the Bush administration did on the war of ideas?
Well, first of all, good morning to everyone, and it's really a delight and an honor to be on stage with these 2 very special people. So thank you for having me. The chapter on the war of ideas is really vital to America right now. And what Mr. Hadley was talking about in terms of lessons learned and where we find ourselves, there's a lot of conversation in America today around ideologies of us versus them, and how you fight them, regardless if it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or if it's a white supremacist, or if it's QAnon, whatever the ideology is, there's an us versus them component. When I was working on what we called the war of ideas, which is the ideological component of the war, and at that time we were talking about, of course, Al-Qaeda. We were talking about the ideology of a terrorist organization that was claiming the mantle of Islam to do their nefarious work. How they recruited requires them to convince people, to radicalize them. And so what you saw at this time, after we had been attacked, is a president who understood that there was far more we had to do to fight this enemy. It was not going to be good enough to only have a kinetic war, to use our traditional defenses against Al-Qaeda, that we had to, in fact, go farther. And we had to think more creatively about how to stop people from finding that ideology appealing. That is the war of ideas. So what I think about when I think about what we worked on for all those years at the NSC and beyond was how do we stand up an infrastructure in the US government that was not prepared for the kind of ideology that we were dealing with. And so you saw a president do, I think, 3 really important things that are important for us today. The first is to say that the ideological component of the war was essential, that we could not only do things with soldiers on the ground, but we had to work on ideological soldiers. So one, thinking about how purposeful that was. Secondly, to understand that the US government was not going to be able to do this alone, that in fact we had to look at other components of our international society to be able to push back against this ideology. We did not have the credibility to stop. At that time, we were dealing with the ideology of al-Qaeda, so we knew that al-Qaeda was going after young Muslims and radicalizing them. The US government was in no position to be able to get into the conversation with young Muslims around the world about not joining a group like al-Qaeda. So how do we stand up third parties? What does the business sector need to do? What does philanthropy need to do? And how do we engage with civil society in a different way? That was revolutionary thinking in my mind. We did not have an infrastructure that was actually thinking that way. And the third really vital component was, in fact, the actual infrastructure of the interagency. Were we prepared to fight this kind of ideological battle? And the answer was no. We didn't have the tools in our toolbox to deal with this kind of threat. We were dealing with ideological battles around a Cold War. And so at the time that we were dealing in the Cold War, we had USIA, we had a really robust public diplomacy arm, we had lots of money that was going into fighting ideologies of us versus them in a different form. But what are we to do now? How do we stand up an interagency to deal with an ideological war? And so President Bush's approach to look at those 3 components, I think, is really important because it set the stage for how we thought about the power of soft power, how we thought about what we could do with more creative thinking, with looking at a whole of government approach in looking and working with and partnering with civil society in how we need to be talking about the importance of fighting the ideology. And obviously, if you bring those dots forward, we obviously went from al-Qaeda to ISIS. We went from not thinking that white supremacy was going to be a problem anywhere in the world, not to speak of our country, to a place in 2023 where we get all of those ideologies at once. And so why is this chapter important? It's important because we have lessons to be learned. We can understand that the pivotal components of thinking about what needed to be done were laid out. But I will say, to your last question, in terms of where we are today, we have not scaled up soft power the way we could. And I will tell you, for both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration where I served, there's no shortage of creative ideas on how to get civil society to do more. The problem has been the scale and the money and the interest in putting ideology forward in a more important way.
Well, where you ended is where I wanted to follow up, which is, Farah, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the challenges, right, that you saw by the end of the Bush administration, and obviously you're in a unique position because you were appointed by Hillary Clinton in the next administration, so you saw both sides of the transition. You talked a little bit about some of what the Bush administration was trying to do that was important and successful. What were some of the challenges, and you talk about them in the book, that you think were maybe less successful and where the Obama team had to do a bit more heavy lifting?
Well, I think that the structural conversation in America about dealing and engaging with Muslims became very political. Instead of looking things from the perspective of the US government is not trying to get into the way in which a young Muslim grows up, but rather do more to hear the voices of young Muslims around the world, to act as the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground. A lot of that's actually what happened. But the perception became problematic. It became very political. You saw us go from, I just explained what the Bush administration was trying to do with the war of ideas. The Obama team understood how important it was to engage with Muslims, obviously, but the perspective, the way in which they framed it was a little bit differently set out. But the tools in the toolbox were the same. Civil society was essential. I mean, I think one of the most incredible things the Bush administration did was this third-party component that I talked about. We were getting other players to actually build networks that would make a difference in terms of building resilience and inoculating communities. US government had not done that kind of thing. We weren't going to places in which Muslims were living as minorities. We were not just looking at Muslim majority states. We were saying to the world that we, as the United States, understand the importance of the diversity of Islam. We understand how important pluralism is. We're going to talk to the young Muslim in Spain with as much dignity as the young Muslim in Malaysia, that it didn't matter to us in terms of where on the spectrum somebody who was Muslim sat, whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shia, whether you are a sect within each of those things. We are going forward listening to many different kinds of voices. Now, that's all exceptional, but the weakness becomes in how robust the efforts became. So the two things I will say that are still problematic to this day is one, I talked about money. We do not see Congress giving the kind of money to soft power the way they need to. One of the things that was really lucky for me doing this work in the Bush administration is that the mindset was be creative, be innovative. Don't break any structures, but go forth within the world that we have and try to be as creative as you can. So I had a long runway to actually work with embassies in new ways, but we had the infrastructure to be able to do that within the embassy teams. We aren't seeing that today, Zach. I mean, like today, it is the same kind of approach, very limited in creativity and innovation. So money, creativity, and then the final thing is scale. It is impossible to think about our world in 2023 with the rise of hate of all kinds and not say to yourself, why aren't we doing more? And it's not that the ideas that are on the ground that civil society is doing are bad, it's that they're not big enough, they're not coordinated enough. And I think that is a great weakness right now.
I'd give you a fourth one, which I think was a weakness, and you'll remember, and I think you put it in your chapter, technology.
Yes.
So we, at one point, convened in the Roosevelt Room in the White House, the public affairs and communication folks of the various agencies to talk about how we were doing on the war of ideas and pushing back on the ideology of the terrorists. And in walked a whole bunch of people who looked just like me. They're old guys, gray hair, and they, like me, grew up in the world of press releases and the Sunday shows. And that's not going to cut it in terms of the technology that we invented and that the terrorists were using every day to beat us in the war of ideas. So under Juan Zarate, who was a colleague of both of ours, we sent out a letter to the young folks who run various Silicon Valley companies and are leading in the new technology. And we included a DVD of the propaganda of Al-Qaeda. And he said, this is what we're facing every day. They're using the technology we invented to kill us in the war of ideas. What would you do to respond? And invited them all to come to the White House. And a lot of them showed up. And it was fantastic because they had all kinds of ideas. They talked about technologies that I didn't even know what they were, much less that they actually existed. And we basically bundled that up, and it became an advisory board for the State Department. And I don't know whether it survived the transition or not. But I think we lagged in using technology that we invented that was being used more effectively by hate groups and the like, and terrorist groups. And I think we still lag.
Yes.
I think we're still not there. We're not at the cutting edge. We're not ahead. We're behind. It's lagging.
Could I say one thing on this? One of the things that I talked about in terms of what happened in the Bush administration and reaching out with young Muslims is that we understood that digital natives were really essential to the problem that we are dealing with. And so we were doing all this engagement with, at the time, millennials were the up and coming generations. But today, we're not just looking at Gen Z, we're looking at Gen Alpha also. And so what I would say about government is that, are we up to speed in understanding both Gen Z and Gen Alpha and how they use technology and what makes sense? You can't just talk about TikTok or a Discord or whatever platform we're talking about. You've got to understand the nuance of why those messages or those images or those whatever it is actually makes a difference to a Gen Z versus a Gen Alpha, what is happening inside of them. And 20 years plus after 9/11, we have so much more sophistication and understanding about what is happening to somebody as they absorb this technology. And so the question really becomes, if it was a weakness in the Bush administration because we didn't foresee, are we still doing that today? And are we doing enough to understand what's coming?
Absolutely, and I know you've worked with the Homeland Security Department and others to try and think these issues through. What's interesting is that so much of this discussion so far has been about the role of ideas, right? And the book, Steve, you mentioned that the way the administration thought about these issues was both sort of idealist in part, but also realist in part. And so I wanted to ask you to expand that a little bit. If you can describe a bit, how did yourself and others in the administration sort of combine these two elements and maybe apply them to at least one of the ideas in the book about how does this actually work in practice, right? How do you combine realism and idealism?
So in the book has a foreword by President Bush, and then there is a preface that Condi and I wrote, basically saying that the organizing principle for Bush foreign policy is a balance of power that favors freedom, and that Bush tried to blend the two strains in our foreign policy. There is the idealistic strain, which is associated with Woodrow Wilson, and this is about America stands for freedom, democracy, rule of law, and the protection of human rights, which is true. There is an alternative realist perspective that says those values are fine, but our foreign policy really needs to be about our interests, about the safety and security and prosperity of the American people. And many people say you have to be one or the other. My life experience is that anytime someone says to you it's either one thing or another, it's wrong. It's always some of both. And what Bush tried to do was to combine those, and I think the war on terror is a good example. The realist perspective was we needed to keep the country safe from terrorists who were trying to attack the homeland and kill Americans. Fair enough. Bush believed, though, that in order to achieve that realistic objective, we had to offer an alternative to the ideology of the terrorists, who were inspiring people with a very negative view about society and their role in society. We needed to give them an alternative. The alternative was democracy and freedom and being able to build a hopeful, prosperous, and secure society in their societies at home. That was the alternative version. That was the idealistic strain in our foreign policy. So Bush basically said, in order to achieve the realistic objective of defending the country against terrorist attack, we have to be promoting our ideals about freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights as an alternative to the vision of the terrorists. He also did the same thing in terms of states and his approach to state building. Everybody says, Bush initially wasn't going to do nation building, and then he became a nation builder. Actually, nobody can build another nation other than the people of that nation. But Bush thought that we could, and we had both a moral obligation and a realistic objective of helping countries build prosperous, stable, democratic states that would meet the needs of their people, would not invade their neighbors, and would support the international system with the United States. And I say democratic because his view was that in order to get states that are legitimate, that are sustainable, that are not corrupt, that are able to benefit their people, they needed to be democratic, because that is how you build legitimacy. And it was particularly true in the states in the Middle East, where are really riven by religious and ethnic and linguistic differences. A state like Iraq, post-invasion Iraq, we thought Iraq needed to be democratic. Why? Because that's what the Iraqi people told us they wanted. They wanted to build accountable democratic governments there would be an improvement on what they'd suffered under Saddam Hussein. But we also thought that the only way Iraq would hang together with its communities of Shia, Sunni, and Kurds would be if they were all participating in a democratic framework to build a common future for their country. Otherwise, Iraq would become what a lot of states in the Middle East are, where states where either Sunni oppress Shia, Shia oppress Sunni, and both of them tend to beat up on the Kurds. So again, it was a case that if you want a realistic objective, a stable Middle East, countries that can provide for their people and will not become recruiting grounds and training grounds for terrorists, you needed to build the kind of states that are legitimate, that can provide for their people, and being democratic was a key part of that, achieving that realistic objective.
It's really interesting because I think one thing I observe, having watched the transition from the outside, is that the freedom agenda seems to have been one of the elements that Obama was least comfortable with, right? And you could sense that maybe whether the freedom agenda was sort of affiliated too closely for him with what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, that he felt, as he said, that we should not do stupid stuff, and that the freedom agenda had sort of sometimes pushed us in this direction. So, I mean, Farah, I want to ask you, during the transition, right, you obviously get a new administration coming in, you adopt some things that the old team does, and you drop others. Did you see the freedom agenda flow into what the Obama team was trying to do, especially with Muslim communities, or did that piece sort of fall out a bit over the next few years?
Well, let's remember why we were engaging with Muslims in the first place. We needed to make sure that ideologies that suggested that America was at war with Islam was wrong. And we all know that Al-Qaeda's one of the most important things that they were pushing out there was that, in fact, America was at war with the West. And you saw versions of that.
War with Islam.
With Islam, sorry, yeah. Yes. That would be bad. So as we began to develop how we engage, there were lots of things that were places of common interest. The importance of rule of law, the importance of transparency, the importance of human rights, elements that were in the work that the Bush administration, of course, put forward in that agenda. But I also want to say that I think one of the things that is really critical is hearing different kinds of voices. And this idea of giving dignity and pluralism, and also hearing from a lot of different perspectives was very much a part of the way in which the Obama administration was doing its Muslim engagement. So they were using elements of those that were entrepreneurs, those that were scientists, those that were in the arts, and a lot of that work, in fact, we had already done in Europe. We had already built those kinds of networks, saying we're going to take things from a perspective that wasn't just about defense and security, but we are going to get to know the diversity of Muslims around the world, and in fact, that we understood long term, if 1/4 of the planet is Muslim, and 1 billion Muslims are under the age of 30 at that time, it's more than that today, we had to do more to engage and to puncture Al-Qaeda's talking point that we were at war with Islam. And you saw that get picked up with ISIS, of course, saying the same kind of thing, which is one of their talking points and how they recruit, and why you still see groups like the Taliban and others who are forceful in talking about the West, whatever that means. So we were talking about transparency, we were talking about human rights, we were talking about diversity, we were talking about pluralism, things that were essential to the conversations that we're having with Muslims in both the Obama administration and certainly even today.
I think what Farah said is exactly right, and what she didn't say in that list at the end was the dreaded D word, the democracy word.
Yeah.
And I think the Obama administration's view was Bush had overplayed democracy. We'd made too much of it, and it also had become too owned by the Bush administration. At one point, Madeleine Albright came up to the president and said, "Mr. President, a lot of people think you invented the term democracy, but that's not true. I did." But I think it became too affiliated and associated with the Bush administration. Why was it so important? In 2002, I think it was, Mark may remember, the UNDP came out with a study which asked, why has there not been progress in terms of demographics about prosperity and all the rest in the Arab world? And its conclusion was there were a number of deficits. They didn't use and empower their women, for example, but there was a deficit of democracy. Democracy had sort of throughout the 20th century, had really had a rebirth in terms of Europe, Latin America, even some countries in Africa, but it had skipped over the Middle East. And we'd let that happen because the deal was we thought, well, we'll compromise our democratic principles, we'll support these autocrats because at least we'll get stability out of the Middle East. Well, we sacrificed our principles and we didn't get stability. What we got was Al-Qaeda and 9/11, an attack on the United States. So for the Bush administration, promotion of democracy in the Middle East was part of the solution for turning the chapter and transforming a Middle East that would be stable, but would also be prosperous and democratic. As the Obama administration, I think, became disaffected with the commitment in the Middle East as the Arab Spring in 2011 occurred and then went south and went sour. And it decided it needed to pivot away to China and the United States. Both the Middle East, but also I think the freedom agenda and the promotion of democracy became less and less salient to them. And it really at that time was not an issue with respect to China as it is now. Because what has happened since, of course, is that Russia and China have really emerged as champions of an authoritarian alternative to democracy. And we have a new ideological struggle, which really we didn't see. We only began to see emerging in the Bush administration. So suddenly, democracy promotion, the freedom agenda, is back in vogue, not in terms of the Middle East, but in terms of the struggle against Russia and China and the alternative they're offering the world.
It's fascinating to me in part because when you read the book, there are parts of it that remind me a lot of elements of the Biden administration's policy, right? The blending of realism and idealism at times, the focus on democracy, right, which is back after Obama really and Trump being much more realist, as self-described sometimes. You've got Biden trying to manage these dynamics, which is tough, right? And you know, just watching the Biden team talk about the Summit for Democracy, but then also trying to make sure that they engage in the Global South in ways that the Global South is willing to accept, reminds me a little bit of some of the challenges we were dealing with trying to, you know, explain to Muslim communities what the administration was trying to do without alienating them at the same time with some of the broader language. I have some great questions that are already coming in from the audience, so I'm going to turn to them and folks in the room shortly. But I want to ask you both two questions before we open it up. So the first question for each of you is, looking back at this process, right, at the transition memo process, I think I can say this was a pretty carefully managed process. I remember being in at the end of the administration, and this was very serious, right? And I think it sounds a bit quaint now to say that 2008, 2009 was a difficult political period, but I remember it as a difficult political period. So I want to ask you both, and I'll start with you, Steve. You know, what are some of the big lessons that you take away from the transition process, and you know, what does it take to do it right? What are the most important sort of principles in these transitions?
Interesting. It only works if the outgoing president and the incoming president make a priority and make it work. And I think in the two subsequent transitions, for different reasons, you saw that was not present. It's interesting under the Trump to Biden transition, even though I think President Trump was not interested in participating in a traditional presidential transition, the NSC staff under Robert O'Brien tried to do something very similar to what we had done. And Jake Sullivan, at an event that was held at the U.S. Institute of Peace, thanked O'Brien publicly for all he did to try to smooth the transition. So part of it, so one is, it really takes the two presidents. But two, there's now a tradition and a sort of a culture about and an expectation that there will be a transition. A lot of what the Bush administration did is now enshrined in statute and is actually required of administrations. Now, incoming or outgoing administrations can ignore the law. It happens from time to time. I know it will shock you all, but they don't necessarily have to do it. But I think there is now an expectation that a good transition is a responsibility of an outgoing administration. I think that matters. 3, I think one of the things that comes from the book and the various initiatives that survived and did not survive from the Bush to Obama administration is, and it's unpopular to say and probably impractical in the current age, but if you want and Bush felt this very keenly, if you want an initiative to survive to subsequent administrations, you have to take the time to build bipartisan support for it. You need to build bipartisan support for it on the Hill. You need to get it enshrined in legislation, and you need to sell it and explain it to the American people so that they create an expectation of their politicians that it will continue. That was certainly the case with the sort of PEPFAR initiative to deal with HIV/AIDS, where the president was able to achieve that kind of consensus, and it continues to this day. The war on Iraq is an example, I think, where we're not able to create that kind of bipartisan consensus. In some sense, almost in spite of that, it continues today. We have a different model in Iraq. We're working by, with, and through local forces. We still have 2,500 people in the ground in Iraq. And a Shia prime minister comes to President Biden and says, please keep your troops in Iraq because they help me balance the influence of Iran. So I think there, despite all the fraction and political fraction and disagreements, we had enough consensus that it is kept going in Iraq. Afghanistan is an example, I think, probably where we didn't. So I think the third thing is taking the time to build bipartisan consensus. And I'd say one other thing that's a little bit that comes from the book. It's interesting if you read it, how many of the initiatives of the Bush administration, and I think it's true of other administrations, really come from the president or are framed by the president, or the president is crucial in their implementation and execution. And so many things, preparation for pandemics, the HIV/AIDS, the President Malaria Initiative, the changes in policy of the surge in Iraq, all of this really came from the president. And I think it's true of other administrations as well. For better or for worse, the president is this chief strategist for his or her administration. The president can then empower cabinet officials to carry out that initiative, but the direction and the framing comes from the president in a way that I think Americans don't appreciate, and that's why who's president of the United States really matters.
It's so interesting because the book is really about the handoff mostly from one administration to another, but the importance of the president actually being able to work together and ultimately being the decider in chief, right, is pretty clear throughout the book. Farah, I want to ask you the same question. Some big takeaways from you about what makes a transition effective.
Well, in addition to all the great things that were just said, I'll take it a step sort of into the weeds. There is a necessary component in terms of honor. Those people that have served our country, that are doing it for, I hope, the very best reasons, who have worked really hard on the initiatives on behalf of the president. There needs to be an underscoring of how important it is that we're all talking to each other, old teams and new teams. And one of the things I will say is, you will see as you read this book, it's the why did we choose to do what it is that we did. You only can get to that if you are talking to your peers who are coming in to explain the framework and why we made the decisions that were made. They may or may not like what it is that they hear, but to understand the reasoning is really important. And I found that certainly in all the work that we had done on Muslim engagement, to the great, to my great delight, everybody on the team at the State Department coming in the Obama administration took the time to understand why we were engaging with Muslims. Why were you doing this in Europe? Why did you pick Europe? What happened after the Danish cartoon crisis? Why did you stand this whole initiative on countering violent extremism up? I remember having conversations with both the secretary and others on the team about the thinking and the need. And it wasn't, yes, there were two different political parties, but there was an understanding that we had been attacked on 9/11. We were standing up a different kind of thing. And I can say that one of the components then is not just the dignity of service, that people coming in are wanting to serve their nation, but you do it with honor and you do it with respect in terms of listening to what other colleagues are saying about how they're doing things. So I think it is really important that we come back to a place where we, this bipartisan thing is really, really essential. But there's also a lack of civility that has happened in our country in terms of how we talk with each other, how we listen to each other, and how, certainly in this town, what public service is all about and why you choose to do this on behalf of your nation. And I think if we can go back to some of those fundamental principles, we will have not only greater transitions, but it will be greater for our country.
Farah makes a very important point. It's one of the things we tried to convey in the transition. There's a lot of talk now about the deep state, frustrating the will of the American people, frustrating presidents and all the rest. One of the things we tried to convey was the great respect we had for the men and women who serve in our armed forces, our intelligence officers, our foreign service officers, our development officials. We've had experience now over many years, all three of us, with these communities, and they are a terrific resource for our country. And one of the things we wanted to try to do was to convey that to the incoming administration. It's one of the reasons why the book is dedicated to the people who serve in those four professions, and any royalties from the book will go to organizations, charitable organizations that support those communities. They are a fabulous resource for this country and critical for an effectiveness of our foreign policy. And that's part of the transition, is to convey that to the incoming team who may not have had that kind of experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in a later transition that I had a little window into one of the team members saying, look, we need to have our own stuff. We can't rely on the team that's in place. And that's a huge sort of handicap going in, right? The folks that have been there and that know what's going on day to day, that continuity is really critical. So we're going to open it up for the audience, both here and online. So we have microphones if folks want to raise their hands. The first person I see is Mark Thiessen in the back. So over to
Uh-oh. I'm not sure that's on. Can
Let's
you
see if we
check
can
and
get
make
him a
sure?
different one. Oh, perfect.
There we go.
So one of the lessons that President Bush instilled in all of us was that the lesson of 9/11 was that the lack of freedom in distant lands can affect us here at home. Free nations don't harbor terrorists who carry out catastrophic attacks on the United States. And the freedom agenda seems to be kind of out of vogue, even though it's coming back a little bit with the Democrats in the Biden administration, but less so on the right. But we had another reminder of that with China and the pandemic, because ask yourself, if this pandemic had started in Taiwan instead of China, what would have happened? Would it have been the global configuration? No, because they have a transparent society that would immediately have coordinated with us, tried to stop it, where take measures instead of covering it up for months. So putting aside the lab leak question, it was the lack of freedom in China that contributed to the worst pandemic, which killed more people than in this country than 9/11. Where does the return of the freedom agenda play a role in this new confrontation or challenge we face from communist China and the Sino-Russian challenge? You mentioned that briefly, because I think a lot of people on the right see it in pure realist terms. We have to make sure that we deter them from invading Taiwan, but the freedom really isn't central to this struggle. What's the role of the freedom agenda going forward?
Steve, do you want to jump in?
So it's a good question, and one of the things I think you put your finger on, which is I believe that foreign policy in some sense reflects the domestic policy and the domestic governmental structure of the country that pursues it. And you've given a very good example of how a society that is not based on freedom, transparency, democracy, rule of law, human rights, allowed to spread to the world a pandemic that killed millions of people. So I think the one lesson that the idealists have right and the realists have wrong is that the political structure of countries domestically matters because it gets reflected in their foreign policy. And if you want countries that won't be harboring terrorists, will be devoted to advancing the welfare of their people, will not invade their neighbors, not throw their weight around, and will be responsible members of the international system, you want them to be free and democratic. You're more likely to get that outcome than you are authoritarian societies. So for the realists, part of achieving the realist objective, I think, is the promotion of freedom, democracy. It's tricky in this because China is the kind of threat that the country has never faced. In the Soviet Union, which dominated, the challenge of the Soviet Union, which dominated my generation, the Soviet Union was a military power, but it was an economic pygmy. And it was stuck with an ideology, communism, that in the end of the day did not survive the test of the marketplace of ideas. China is a different proposition altogether, the world's #2 economy and growing, an increasingly a military power, the largest trading partner of most of the world, replacing the United States. This is a formidable challenge. And in order to deal with that challenge, we're going to need to rally the international community. We're going to have to rally our democratic friends and allies, but we're also going to need to rally countries that are not democratic, but who share certain principles like sovereignty, respect for borders, no use of force to throw your weight around and the like. So the trick is, I think, to pull together as broad a network as we can to deal with the realistic objective of managing the challenge China presents, while at the same time working with a democratic core of nations to strengthen democratic institutions and to promote democracy abroad in a way that doesn't alienate those countries that are not democratic, that we do need to deal with the challenge of China. In some sense, it's kind of a concentric circles approach. And that's what we're going to have to do. And I think it's going to require us to be very nuanced in how we deal with the message of promotion of democracy and freedom. And I think the administration started out thinking the great dividing line is between authoritarians and Democrats. And then when they started to put together a conference among democratic countries, the difficulty of deciding who was democratic and who was not was problematic, and those states that were not democratic excluded some of our closest allies. So you've seen the administration sort of move away from that paradigm. I think what you're going to see the American begin to do, the administration to do in reframing, is to talk about the world on offer if you go down the road with China and Russia, and the world on offer if you follow the United States and the West. And I think that framing is probably going to be more resilient and be more inclusive of the countries we need to deal with the problem of China. That's how I would see it.
Farah, I want to just build on that really quickly by asking you a follow-up, which is the world that Steve's describing of sort of concentric circles strikes me as exactly right. And it's similar in some ways to what the Bush administration was thinking with the War of Ideas, right? You obviously had some countries that were absolutely aligned with the United States on almost everything after 9/11. You had others that were in a very different place. But there was a real effort to engage broadly all of those countries in different ways.
Yep.
How do you get that message that both strikes the chord with the core countries that you need on side, but doesn't alienate those that may have different views and different interests?
So we do this all the time, don't we? I mean, this is the art of diplomacy, finding common ground, finding places where you may have not thought that another adversary, perhaps in some dimensions, would actually be an ally in others. And so the only way you can go about that, and certainly the way we did this, I would add one more thing to your point about China, which is their supreme excellence in soft power. They have mastered the game.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the world that is coming, the world that they are building, if we don't do more, that goes into this. And so you will find, and I certainly did in engagement, communities and nations and multilateral organizations that couldn't stand the US's policy in one particular thing, but oh my gosh, the alternative on this would have been that. And so yes, we can do a little bit of this and find that way to work together. Let me give you a very specific example. One of the things that the Bush administration understood in the ideological component is if we did not do more to engage with women, we would be missing one part of society at large. And that we also knew that on the ideological war, that mothers, in fact, could do a lot more than that we were doing. And so we were out engaging with Muslim females who could not stand our policy in Afghanistan or Iraq, but did not want their young kids to join a group like AQ, right? And so toward that end, we found a way to engage. Or certainly after the Danish cartoon crisis in Europe, where when I was engaging on the ground with Muslim communities, they were saying a couple of things. The first is, you're taking the time to listen to us when our own government isn't engaging with us, okay? That's first. Secondly, what do you mean you want to hear our ideas and you're willing to help mobilize those ideas? What we don't like your policy on here, here, and here, but we really like the fact that you're listening to us and we agree with you that this particular component is really important, so we will work with you here, but we won't work with you here. So that, to me, granularity, obviously, I understand that. Last thing, sorry, you were talking about nations. I also want to talk about organizations, because one of the things that we also understood, and we didn't yet talk about this, was that in order to build those third parties that could do more, we didn't just need heads of state, we also needed organizations like the United Nations, of course, the G20, the G7, whatever we're dealing with, but organizations that we may not have always done everything that we knew we wanted to do with them because we had difficulties on some of the issues. One example is the Organization for Islamic Conference. And what the Bush administration said was, can we work with these Muslim majority nations to, in fact, come together on our belief that violence in the name of Islam isn't going to be something that they're going to promote. And in fact, some of these nations who we didn't engage with in some other ways did engage with us on this. So there are ways to do this, but it takes time and it takes creativity, I think, and a little bit of patience.
Patience, nuance, listening, yes. All the skill sets of the U.S. Government, U.S. diplomacy, right?
It's an important point. It's a new world. And if the United States diplomacy is going to succeed in this new world, we're going to have to do business differently. And we're going to have to do the things you just listed, which don't come naturally for Americans, but are what are required in this new circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've got a question online, which sort of builds on this theme. I'll just read it to you. They ask, did terrorism and the wars in the Middle East crowd out the other challenges that the United States was facing around the world during the Bush administration? And did it overshadow the administration's foreign policy successes in addressing some of these challenges? Steve, do you want to take a first?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. And this is where we started out earlier. Everybody thinks all we did in the Bush administration was Afghanistan, Iraq, and the war on terror. And if you look at the book, look at the transition memos, just look at the table of contents, we're dealing with all of the relevant issues at the same time, all the time, and have a lot of initiatives in all of them. So I would say that it did not, and it's not just unique to the Bush administration. I would say to you that any administration, that is the challenge of any administration. I'll give you an example. Brent Scowcroft used to say that when he was National Security Advisor, which was under President Ford, and then Bush 41 was before a lot of you were born, which is a long time ago, he would say that was in the world of the Cold War. And so Cold War, there was at any point in time I was dealing with one big thing, which was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was a well-known problem and changed very slowly. And on the margins, I would have at any point in time 1 or 2 regional crises I'd have to deal with. Fast forward to the post-Cold War world, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, he's got a 20-burner stove. He's got pots on each burner, and each pot is about to overflow. And he's running from pot to pot, stirring them to keep, and trying to turn down the flame to keep them, any of them from boiling over. That is the world in which you find yourselves. So any administration now has got to do 40 things at once, as challenging as it is.
That's so true. All right, we'll go back to the audience here. So other questions right here up front, if we can get a microphone. And just state your name and affiliation and a quick question, please.
Hi, thank you. Will with ISW. So just going back to, jumping back from the dichotomy between realism and idealism and how our policymakers could potentially reconcile the two. My question has to do with the exact balance that we strike, especially when it comes to, as you mentioned, potentially building a coalition of allies, balancing coalition per se in the Indo-Pacific, where certain states would choose a hedging strategy over a more balancing or more confrontational approach. So, but at the same time, we're not necessarily appealed by the liberal rhetoric of the freedom agenda. So my question is, where do you exactly strike that balance? Would you say, for example, during the Cold War, the Kirkpatrick doctrine has been implemented? Would that be a potential model to pursue, or where would you strike that exact delicate balance between the two?
What might be a model? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
The Kirkpatrick, sort of model. So I guess one, just to build on this a little bit, I think part of the big challenge we're seeing right now when the U.S. approaches China is there's so many countries that don't want to have to choose, right? And they'll say this explicitly, right? Singapore, right? The prime minister, who you know well, will say very explicitly, look, we don't want to have to choose. And yet, we're not asking them to choose, but they do have to make some choices, right? And I guess one thing which I think comes up in the book, including in the chapter on China and East Asia, is how do you get this balance right between the countries that really want to hedge, right? They don't want to make these clear choices, and the U.S. desire to work with countries to press them to go the right direction. How do you do this?
Well, I would go back to what Farah was talking about in China. I think it's a good example. I think what you do is you look at the set of principles that are part of the international order that are broadly agreed, and that it's in the interest of countries that have China as a neighbor to endorse and strengthen, even if they're not democratic. So we're worried about war over Taiwan. So I think the kinds of principles that say respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, no use of force to coerce your neighbors, no coercing your neighbors to compromise their interests on behalf of your own. You can articulate a set of principles that are part of this international order, that are part of the UN Charter, that is in the interest of the Singapores and the Japanese and the South Korea to have respected so that they are not intimidated and coerced by China. That's where you start. You say, look, these are principles in the international order. The interesting thing is about those principles is China also subscribes to those principles. And there was a time when Russia did, but no longer. So particularly with respect to China, it puts them in a box. You have a set of principles that they have technically agreed on that you get everybody else to rally around. And I think that's really how you do the approach. And it doesn't mean you abandon your democracy agenda, doesn't mean you abandon human rights, but when you're dealing with close allies, the question is, how do you pursue those? And we had a rule, you praise in public and criticize in private. And I think that's generally the right approach with close friends and allies. With adversaries, it's a little bit different.
Farah, do you want to add anything out of that? Or?
No, I just would say something that is not at all connected, but I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure to say this. One of the things that was not said at the outset was how new this book really is. We've never seen anything like it ever. And I think one of the things that's so important about the fact that you're actually looking at the transition memos is that all the spin that you see from the way people are interpreting history is evidenced by exactly what was written and what was handed forward. So I would urge us to take a realistic look at what the problem was, what was laid out as successes and weaknesses, and what President Bush put in place for be cautious of what's coming in the future. And I think you see all of those things in Handoff.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. So the book is Handoff. We have copies in the back. But thank you so much, Steve and Farah, for spending time with us this morning. Really fantastic discussion, and we're all so appreciative. So please join me in thanking our guests.
Let us thank you for hosting this event and for all of you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.